My name is Gabriella Hart, and I'm 31 years old. I remember the exact sound my body made when it hit the marble, a wet crack, followed by an echo that still plays in my mind at night. I lay at the bottom of the museum staircase, one leg twisted unnaturally beneath me, blood trickling down my temple. My ribs ached with every breath, my vision blurred, but I could still see her, Amelia, my sister. She stood at the top of the stairs, staring down at me. No panic, no guilt, just silence, and the tiniest flicker of satisfaction. "You should have stayed in your lane," she whispered just before stepping back into the building. Before I go any further, I want to ask, where are you watching from? Please like this video, drop your city or country in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories like this. Because what happened next didn't just expose a lie, it unraveled a lifetime of betrayal. Seconds later, I heard heels clacking toward me, fast, my mother's voice rising in panic. "Oh my God, Amelia, what happened?" "She fell," Amelia said breathlessly, her voice already trembling with fake emotion. "I tried to stop her, but she tripped." I tried to speak, but pain pinned my jaw shut. My fingers twitched, my chest burned. Then I heard a different voice, firm and calm. "There's a camera above the entrance," said a museum security guard. "We've got it all." And in that moment, broken, bleeding, and helpless, I realized something I never expected. This time, the truth was recorded. I didn't come from a family that celebrated quiet resilience. I came from a family that worshipped appearances, where the loudest voice always won. And Amelia? She was a symphony of charm, manipulation, and perfectly timed tears. Growing up, she was the daughter everyone saw. I was the one they forgot to photograph. She got the praise, the attention, the opportunities. I got lectures on being too serious, too sensitive, too much. But I learned to carve my own path. I worked harder, rose faster, and last month I became the director of exhibitions at the Northbridge Museum, a role I earned without a single favor from anyone in my family. They didn't congratulate me. They barely acknowledged it, except for Amelia. She showed up, not out of support, but out of strategy. She introduced herself to donors as family of the director. She posed beside my installations as if they were hers. She smiled for photos, gave quotes to journalists, and soaked in the spotlight like it belonged to her. But yesterday, I overheard her say something that pushed me too far. "She wouldn't be here without us," she told one of the museum board members. "Her success is a family success." It wasn't. That night, I asked to speak with her privately. I wanted to set boundaries. I wanted her to stop exploiting my work, my name, my moment. She just stared at me, calm as ever. "You think this career makes you untouchable?" she said. "You're still the same girl who used to cry when I got the last slice of cake." And this morning, when I saw her waiting near the stairs, smiling, arms crossed, I should have known. I turned to walk away, and that's when it happened. Her hand hit the center of my back, hard, deliberate. I lost my balance instantly. My heel slipped, my shoulder clipped the railing, my body twisted through the air. The stairs rushed up to meet me. The pain was blinding. But even through the haze, I knew this wasn't clumsiness. This wasn't an accident. It was intentional. And as I faded in and out of consciousness, I clung to one sentence. "There's a camera. We've got it recorded." For the first time in my life, Amelia wouldn't get away with it. The hospital lights were too bright, too white, the kind of sterile glow that made you feel more like a problem to be solved than a person in pain. I was wheeled in through the emergency entrance, my body strapped down, each bump on the stretcher sending a shockwave through my ribs. I heard the words, possible concussion, fracture, and priority CT, but the voices all blended into static. What I really wanted to hear was someone asking, "What happened to you?" Not, "What did you do?" No one asked that. No one asked me anything. I remember blinking up at the ceiling as the stretcher rolled forward, counting the overhead lights like I used to count stars as a child when I couldn't sleep. 1, 2, 3. Anything to stay awake. Anything to stay conscious. Because if I lost consciousness, I'd lose my chance to speak. I couldn't let that happen. Not this time. At one point, I caught a glimpse of my mother in the corridor, red-eyed and pacing, one manicured hand clutching her purse like it was a lifeline. Amelia sat beside her, wrapped in a museum security blanket, eyes downcast, the very picture of guiltless concern. It was all a performance. A carefully rehearsed tragedy starring Amelia as the devastated sister. And me? I was the cautionary tale, the clumsy one, the unstable one, the one who couldn't handle stairs. I couldn't move, but I could see, and I saw everything. By the time the doctors had finished their assessments, I was floating somewhere between pain and medication-induced haze. A cracked rib, a sprained wrist, bruising along my left side, and a mild concussion that would leave my head pounding for days. But I was alive. Barely. Later that night, as the morphine dulled the edges of my awareness, I heard muffled voices in the hallway just outside my room. My mother's sharp whisper cut through first. She sounded more annoyed than worried. My father's deeper tone followed, clipped and controlled. They weren't discussing my injuries. They were discussing logistics, insurance forms, liability questions, public statements. They were already spinning the narrative, deciding which version of the story would do the least damage to their image. Not my truth, their version. And in that version, Amelia had tried to help me. I was the one who slipped. I was the one who lost control. The irony nearly made me laugh, if laughing didn't feel like being stabbed between the ribs. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to focus. I had to remember everything, every word, every detail. Amelia's hand on my back, the angle of her wrist, the moment before gravity took over. It hadn't been a reflex. It had been a decision. Hours passed in fragments. 4 beeps, nurses checking vitals, the cool pressure of an oxygen monitor clipped to my finger. Sometime after midnight, a hospital social worker stopped by, clipboard in hand, and a sympathetic expression carefully arranged on her face. She asked if I felt safe. I said yes. Because what else was I supposed to say? That I was terrified of my own sister? That the people who should have protected me were already lining up to protect her instead? She gave me a pamphlet and left quietly. The next morning, a nurse named Mallory came in to check my vitals. She was kind, soft-spoken, and moved gently around my injuries. She asked how I was feeling. I said sore. She smiled and said that was normal. Then, hesitantly, I asked about the museum, about the footage. Mallory's face didn't change, but something in her eyes did. She told me the hospital had been contacted by Northbridge's head of security, that there was footage, that it was being preserved. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. There was proof. That afternoon, my parents arrived. My mother brought flowers. My father brought forms. Amelia came too, of course, her left hand wrapped in a soft bandage for no reason I could understand other than dramatics. She hovered near the door, wide-eyed and fragile. I watched them approach like they were strangers. My mother made small talk about the weather. My father launched into a monologue about liability. They wanted me to sign something, an accident report supposedly, just a formality, he said. Just for insurance. But I could read. And it wasn't just an accident report. It was a waiver. A document saying I took full responsibility for my fall. That no foul play had occurred. That no one else was to blame. I refused. My father's face darkened. My mother's voice dropped an octave. They started using the same words they'd used my whole life. Dramatic, confused, overreacting. Amelia didn't say a word. Not at first. She just looked at me with those wide, innocent eyes. Then, when our parents turned away, she leaned in and whispered something only I could hear. "No one will believe you." That was the moment I understood what this really was. Not an accident, not a misunderstanding, a warning. They were going to bury the truth under paperwork and whispers. They were going to make me the unstable one. They were going to protect her again. But this time, they wouldn't be the only ones with a story to tell. That night, alone in my hospital bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about everything I'd given up to get to where I was. Friends, weekends, peace. I'd built a career from the ground up, earned every step, every promotion, every opportunity. I hadn't taken shortcuts. I hadn't asked for favors. I had worked. And now that I finally had something to lose, my own family was trying to take it from me. All because Amelia couldn't stand to watch me succeed. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing her voice. "No one will believe you." But there was one person who might. The next morning, a nurse I hadn't seen before entered my room. She was older, confident, with a clipped tone and observant eyes. Her name tag read Marlene. She checked my chart, adjusted my IV, and then looked at me with a steady expression. "You took a fall down a stairwell at a public museum," she said. "You're lucky." I nodded, my throat dry. She continued, her voice quieter now. "Museum security called earlier. They confirmed the footage is clear." My heart thudded in my chest. Marlene met my eyes. "Whatever happened out there, don't let anyone rewrite it for you." I blinked hard, emotions swelling up in my throat. For the first time since I hit the floor, someone saw me. Not the story my family wanted to tell, not the version they were selling. Me, the one who fell, the one who was pushed, and the one who was finally ready to fight back. The third morning in the hospital began like the others. Blood pressure cuff, temperature check, the smell of disinfectant and day-old flowers lingering in the room. But something had shifted in me overnight. Maybe it was the confirmation from Nurse Marlene about the footage. Maybe it was the way she said it, with conviction, not sympathy. Like she wasn't guessing. She knew. Whatever it was, I woke up feeling different. Less like a victim, more like a witness. I sat upright slowly, my ribs aching under the pressure, my sprained wrist cradled in my lap. There was still pain, still bruises. But for the first time since the fall, I felt clarity cut through the fog. The camera had seen what happened, and if the camera had seen it, I wasn't crazy. I wasn't exaggerating. I wasn't being dramatic. I had been pushed, and soon someone else besides me would have to face that truth. Around 10 a.m., a young hospital administrator knocked on my door and asked if I was willing to speak with security. I said yes, even before she finished the sentence. They came in quietly, 2 officers in navy blazers with ID badges clipped to their belts, followed by a woman in a gray suit. She introduced herself as Monica Evans, the risk assessment liaison between the hospital and outside institutions. She smiled politely, but her eyes were calculating. They asked if I was comfortable, if I was mentally clear, if I remembered the incident. I told them I did. Every detail. I described the angle of the stairwell, Amelia's position behind me, the force of the shove. I explained the argument that led up to it, the way she tried to frame it as an accident, the way my parents instantly rallied behind her. They took notes quietly, rarely interrupting. Monica waited until I'd finished, then pulled a tablet from her leather folder. "We've received the full security footage from the North Bridge Museum," she said, "multiple angles, including the overhead entrance camera, which shows the entire stairwell." My heartbeat thundered in my ears. "I believe you should see it," she added. "Mr. Dawson, the museum director, authorized it personally." The screen lit up. And there I was, clear as day, walking through the lobby with Amelia trailing just behind me. No one else in frame, no other movement. We stopped near the top of the stairs. She stepped closer. I turned to say something. Then, her hand, my back, a precise, unmistakable push. I stumbled forward. My legs gave out. My body folded over the stairs. I disappeared from frame. Amelia paused for half a beat, then burst into motion, running toward the door. The performance began seconds later. I didn't cry watching it. I didn't scream. I didn't look away. I just watched, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to convince someone of what had happened. The truth played itself on screen, frame by frame, without apology. Monica turned off the tablet and met my gaze. "We'll be filing an official incident report with both the hospital and law enforcement," she said. "There's a clear case for assault. Do you wish to press charges?" I didn't answer right away, not because I was uncertain, but because I knew that once I said yes, everything would change. My family would go to war for Amelia. They would spin, lie, leverage every connection they had. They'd say I was unstable, that I was obsessed, that I misunderstood. But I was done protecting people who harmed me. I was done pretending I was the problem. "Yes," I said. "I want to press charges." The moment the words left my mouth, a silence settled over the room. Not heavy, not tense. Solid, like a line had been drawn, and there would be no stepping back across it. The officers nodded. One of them handed me a paper to sign. The other said a detective would be assigned to the case within 24 hours. After they left, Nurse Marlene returned. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. She just looked at me and said, "Good." That afternoon, my parents returned. I wasn't surprised. What surprised me was that they brought Amelia. She wore soft colors now. Her hair was tied loosely. She looked fragile, vulnerable, almost childlike. But the moment our eyes met, I saw it, the calculation behind her expression, the same cold confidence she had the moment she pushed me. My mother launched into a practiced speech about forgiveness, about how families fall apart when resentment festers. My father offered legal documents again, a new version, cleaner, less aggressive. Just a mutual agreement to settle the misunderstanding. I didn't interrupt. I let them talk. And when they finished, I looked straight at Amelia. "I saw the footage," I said. That was it. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes dropped for just a second. But it was enough. They knew. I knew. And now the world would know. They didn't argue. Not then. Not out loud. They just stood there, suddenly quiet. My father's face blank. My mother's eyes glistening, but not with guilt, with fear. Their version of reality was cracking, and there was no script for what came next. That night, the detective called. Her name was Sarah Delgado. Calm, direct, professional. She said she'd be visiting me in person the next morning to take my formal statement. She also confirmed the footage had been reviewed by the district attorney's office. There was more than enough to move forward. Before she hung up, she asked if I was prepared for what this would mean, not just legally, but emotionally. It's easy to file charges. It's harder when the person on the other side shares your blood. I told her the truth, that I'd already lost them. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about pride. It was about finally telling the truth and refusing to be erased again. And if that meant becoming the villain in their story, so be it. Detective Sarah Delgado arrived just before noon. Her presence filled the room in a way that was both quiet and commanding. She looked to be in her 40s, dressed in a blazer that meant business and eyes that had long since learned to read through the noise. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She asked if I was ready, and I was. She set up a small voice recorder on the rolling table beside my bed, clicked her pen, and opened a leather-bound notebook. Everything about her was composed, efficient, but not cold. She didn't look at me like a broken body or a fragile witness. She looked at me like someone telling the truth. She asked for my full name, my age, my occupation. Then, with a nod, she asked me to recount the incident in my own words, from the moment Amelia approached me at the museum to the second I hit the marble floor. I told her everything: the lead-up, the rivalry, the career I built, the jealousy that bloomed louder each time I stepped further into my own success. I explained how Amelia inserted herself into my exhibition, posed with my work, claimed my accomplishments as hers. And then I described the moment: the push, the fall, the pain, the silence, the performance that followed. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just spoke. When I finished, Detective Delgado paused the recorder and asked, softly, if Amelia had ever hurt me before. That question sat in the air, because the answer wasn't a simple yes or no. Amelia had never left bruises, but she had left damage. Years of whispered insults passed off as jokes. Years of taking credit, of twisting the truth, of cutting me down with a smile that everyone else mistook for charm. She had undermined me in job interviews, once told a board member I had emotional regulation issues after I was offered a panel seat she wanted. She had flirted with my ex, claimed my ideas, dismissed my art. No broken bones, but plenty of broken trust. I told the detective about all of it. She listened. She didn't flinch. She simply wrote it down. Then she confirmed that the DA's office had seen the footage, and they were preparing formal charges: assault with intent to cause bodily harm. She asked if I had any further concerns. And I did. Not about the law, about the fallout. Because the Hart family didn't go down quietly. I asked what would happen once this became public. She said the hearing would be scheduled within days. Once it did, names would circulate. Documents would be accessible. It would make its way to the press, especially considering my role at Northbridge. She wasn't trying to scare me, just prepare me. But I wasn't scared. Not anymore. That evening, just before dinner trays were delivered, my phone lit up with a message from Denise, my colleague at the museum. It was a screenshot. A post from Amelia's social media account. She had posted a photo of herself in the Northbridge lobby, wearing the same outfit from the day of the incident, with a long caption: "Sometimes we try to help people who don't want to be helped. My sister and I had an emotional moment during a family disagreement, and she fell. I've been advised not to say more, but I ask for your prayers as we go through this difficult time." The comments were flooding in. Some supportive, some suspicious, some from people I recognized, family friends, donors, former classmates, expressing confusion, concern, and the dreaded phrase, "There are always two sides." My stomach twisted, but not from pain. It was the first blow in the campaign I knew was coming. The version where Amelia was misunderstood, where I was troubled, where everything was a tragic accident between sisters. But this time, I had more than memories. I had footage, I had my voice, and I had people starting to listen. The next morning, I received a call from Martin, my boss at Northbridge. He was careful with his words, professional, neutral, but his tone gave him away. Someone had already contacted him. Not the police, not a reporter, my mother. She had called him personally to clarify the situation and suggest I was under emotional strain and possibly unfit to resume my duties in the near future. I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was textbook. My mother always believed that if you control the story, you control the truth. But Martin wasn't buying it. He told me he had spoken to Dawson, the museum director, who confirmed the incident and acknowledged that security footage left very little room for doubt. He told me to focus on healing, that my job was secure, that the board stood behind me. I thanked him, voice catching slightly in my throat. Because for the first time, someone in my professional world wasn't treating me like a liability. They were treating me like a leader who had been wronged. By afternoon, I was contacted by a local reporter. She had caught wind of the upcoming hearing and asked if I wanted to provide a statement. I declined, politely for now, but I knew the story would run either way. It was already moving. That night, Nurse Marlene returned for her shift. She checked my vitals, changed a bandage, and then lingered a moment longer than usual. She told me that the hospital staff had quietly started comparing notes, that my story had been spreading. Staff who'd seen my family's behavior, doctors who'd noticed the subtle manipulations, the way Amelia had cried too quickly, the way my parents deflected every medical question by shifting to legal concerns. Marlene said she had submitted her own report to administration, not because she had to, but because she believed me. She paused at the door before leaving and added something I'll never forget. "You're not difficult, Gabriella. You're not dramatic. You're just finally standing up." Later that evening, I received a text from someone I hadn't heard from in over a year. My cousin Lindsay. It said, "I always knew there was something off about the way your parents treated you. I'm so sorry I didn't say anything sooner. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." Just that. Simple. But in that moment, it felt like a crack of light through a locked door, because the truth has weight. And when it finally lands, it leaves ripples. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized something strange. I wasn't just fighting to prove what Amelia had done. I was also unraveling what my family had built around her, this illusion of perfection, this fortress of lies, this story where I was always the difficult one. And for the first time, I wasn't standing on the outside of that story anymore. I was rewriting it. The hearing was set for Friday morning. That gave me exactly 3 days to prepare, legally, emotionally, psychologically. My physical body was still healing, but the real bruises, the ones no scan could detect, were beginning to surface in ways I hadn't expected. I wasn't afraid of the courtroom. I was afraid of what my family would try to do before we got there. And I didn't have to wait long. On Tuesday afternoon, my parents showed up at the hospital again. Unannounced, of course, but not uninvited in their own minds. My father entered first, carrying a leather portfolio and a face he used in boardrooms. Calm, persuasive, rehearsed. My mother followed a few steps behind, dressed in her grieving matriarch palette. Soft gray blouse, pearl earrings, and a fresh blowout. They looked like they were posing for a press release, not visiting their injured daughter. They asked how I was feeling. I didn't answer. My mother commented on how pale I looked. I said nothing. My father cleared his throat, laid the folder across my tray table, and finally spoke. "There's still time to stop this from escalating." I stared at the folder but didn't open it. I already knew what was inside. Another waiver, another settlement offer, another legal lie dressed up as peacekeeping. "This doesn't have to ruin everything," he continued. "The museum, your reputation, our family. Think about your career, Gabriella. You're in a high-profile position. If this goes public, you'll always be associated with a scandal." I finally looked up at him. I'm already associated with a scandal. I just didn't create it. My mother flinched slightly, as if the truth were offensive to her ears. "She's your sister," she whispered, almost like a plea. "She made a mistake." "No," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "She made a choice." That was when the mask slipped. My father's expression hardened, his tone sharpened. "If you don't drop this, Gabriella, we will have no choice but to cut ties entirely, financially, emotionally, publicly." It wasn't a threat. It was a familiar script. The same control tactics I'd grown up under: obedience in exchange for affection, loyalty in exchange for silence. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I wasn't 12 years old, begging to be seen. I was 31, in a hospital bed, recovering from injuries my own sister had inflicted. You already cut ties, I said quietly. You just didn't do it with scissors. You did it with years of pretending I didn't matter. They left without another word. That evening, Detective Delgado called again. She said Amelia's attorney had submitted a pre-hearing statement that described the incident as a sibling misunderstanding that resulted in accidental injury. He claimed Amelia had acted out of emotional distress due to our grandmother's recent passing, something that hadn't even happened. It was all fabrication, and it would only get worse. Later that night, Nurse Marlene brought me tea and sat at the edge of my bed. She asked if I was nervous about the hearing. I admitted I was, not because I doubted my version of events, but because I knew what my family was capable of when backed into a corner. They'll try everything, I said, and if that doesn't work, they'll try something new. She nodded thoughtfully and then told me something I didn't expect. You're not the only person who's ever ended up here because of a lie someone needed the world to believe. I asked what she meant. She didn't answer directly. She just looked at me like someone who understood too well, like someone who had carried someone else's silence for too long. The next day, something changed. I received a message on my personal email account. No subject line. Just a name I hadn't heard in a year. Jonah Michaels. He was Amelia's ex. They had dated for almost 2 years, on and off, toxic and theatrical. The kind of relationship that never really ended, just paused between disasters. When they broke up for good, he vanished. I hadn't heard from him since. But now, he had something to say. I opened the email with trembling hands. Gabriella, I saw the article about the hearing. I know we haven't spoken in a long time, but I think it's time I tell you something I should have said a year ago. I still have screenshots, voicemails, and a police report I never filed. If you want them, I'll bring them in person. I believe you. Jonah. I sat in stunned silence, rereading the message again and again. I hadn't known he'd kept anything. I didn't even know he believed me. He was always under Amelia's spell back then. But something must have shifted. Something must have snapped. I replied immediately. 2 hours later, he showed up at the hospital. He looked older, thinner, like someone who had finally crawled out of something heavy. He didn't sit, just opened his backpack and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were screenshots of texts Amelia had sent in the weeks leading up to our exhibition. In one, she wrote, "Gabby's big debut next week. Can't wait to watch her fall on her face. Literally, if I have to." Another, "She thinks she's better than all of us now. Might be time to bring her back down." And then, most chilling of all, a voice memo. Her voice, unmistakable. "I'm not going to hurt her. Just shake her a little. She needs to remember she's not untouchable." I listened 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just felt still. Jonah also included a note from a therapy session he'd attended shortly after they broke up. The therapist had advised him to seek help after he described Amelia's outbursts. He never followed through, but he kept the paperwork. Maybe part of him always knew she'd go too far someday. I thanked him. He said he'd testify, if needed. Then he left. No dramatics. No apologies. Just a quiet exhale, like he'd finally done something right. That night, I called Detective Delgado and told her everything. She asked me to forward the materials immediately. I did. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt the momentum shift. It was no longer just my word against theirs. It was my word and evidence, receipts, recordings, witnesses, screenshots. Proof that Amelia had spent years shaping a story where I was always the overreactor, the bitter older sister, the jealous one. But now the script was changing, and I wasn't just surviving the fall anymore. I was getting ready to rise from it. The courthouse was smaller than I imagined, less dramatic, fewer columns and echoes. but the weight of what was about to happen still pressed against my ribs harder than any fracture. I sat in a wheelchair near the front of the courtroom, surrounded by strangers in suits who were about to speak for or against the truth. Detective Delgado sat beside me, calm and poised. Across the aisle, my parents whispered to Amelia's attorney, Richard Dalton, a man so polished he looked carved from marble. Amelia herself sat between them, a light gray sweater draped over her shoulders like a costume piece. Her face was perfectly composed. Not a trace of panic. Not yet. Then the door opened. The judge entered. Everyone stood, except me. Judge Harris was a short, serious woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no tolerance for anything off script. She nodded once, then signaled the proceedings to begin. The district attorney started by presenting the case file, summarizing the charges: assault with intent to cause bodily harm, supported by security footage, witness testimony, and digital evidence suggesting premeditation. Amelia's attorney immediately objected to the phrase premeditation, arguing that this was a tragic accident between sisters. He asked that the judge consider the emotional state of both parties and the delicate family history. Judge Harris raised an eyebrow and said, "We'll see." Then they played the video. The courtroom was silent as the screen lit up. I watched myself appear at the top of the stairwell again, walking calmly, speaking with Amelia. I turned away. She moved forward. Her hand struck the center of my back. I stumbled forward, fell. There was no sound, but the truth didn't need audio. You could see it in the way she shoved, the lack of hesitation, the calm moment before the panic act began. When the video ended, no one said a word. No one. Even Dalton, the seasoned attorney, looked momentarily frozen. Judge Harris cleared her throat and spoke with precise clarity. "That footage shows a deliberate physical act. Is there any argument from the defense as to what we just saw?" Dalton stood, adjusted his tie, and began what sounded like a speech he'd prepared before seeing the video. He mentioned sisterly tension, stress, family grief. He implied I had mental health issues stemming from childhood that led me to reinterpret events through a lens of rivalry. He said Amelia regretted what happened but hadn't meant harm. Then he played his card. He submitted a written character statement from my parents. In it, they described Amelia as gentle, supportive, and emotionally fragile. They referred to the incident as a sad misunderstanding and suggested that Cassandra, yes, they wrote the wrong name, had always exaggerated emotional conflicts in the family. The judge looked over the document and placed it aside. Then came my turn. Detective Delgado read a summary of my injuries, described my statements, and introduced the digital evidence forwarded by Jonah Michaels: screenshots, voicemails, written threats. Then she submitted a notarized letter from Jonah's therapist describing Amelia's behavioral patterns, including physical aggression, emotional gaslighting, and the incident involving a wine bottle thrown across a room. The therapist never filed a report, but the documentation was solid, real, and damning. Judge Harris read everything in silence. Then she asked a single question. "Has the defendant ever denied sending these messages?" Dalton tried to object, but Amelia responded before he could. She stood. "I was upset," she said. "She made me feel invisible my whole life." It was the first time I heard her admit anything, and she said it not to explain, but to justify. The judge didn't flinch. "Do you deny pushing your sister down a flight of stairs?" Amelia's lips parted, then closed again. Dalton placed a hand on her arm. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge nodded, then looked at me. "Miss Hart, do you wish to make a statement?" I nodded. My voice was thin but steady. "I built a career from scratch. I never asked for help, never expected them to clap for me, but I never expected them to push me, literally, to the ground either. What happened to me wasn't an accident. It was years of being erased, finally made physical. There was a long silence. Then Judge Harris spoke. "I've reviewed the footage. I've reviewed the testimony and supporting materials. Based on the evidence, I find sufficient grounds to proceed with formal charges. This case will move to trial unless an agreement is reached. Bail is set at $35,000. The defendant is ordered to surrender her passport and remain within the state." Dalton stood to argue, but the judge dismissed the court before he could finish. Amelia's face remained frozen, but her hands trembled. For the first time, she wasn't in control. As the courtroom emptied, my parents approached me, my mother first. Her face was blotchy from crying, though I couldn't tell if it was sadness or humiliation. She leaned down as if she wanted to whisper something kind, redemptive, final. Instead, she hissed, "You've destroyed this family." Then they walked past me like strangers. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Detective Delgado walked beside me as I was wheeled down the steps. She glanced at the press and said, "They'll make this messy. But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." I nodded, because it was. Later that night, I sat on Aunt Lily's porch, wrapped in a blanket with my leg elevated and a cup of peppermint tea in hand. The stars overhead felt closer than usual. She hadn't come to court, but she watched the live stream. She said only one thing when she saw me. "I always knew something was broken in the way they treated you. I'm just sorry it had to take this much pain to prove it." We sat in silence for a while. And then she added quietly, "You didn't destroy the family, Gabriella. You just stopped pretending it was whole." The trial wasn't for another 5 weeks, but the aftermath of the hearing arrived within 24 hours. My name was trending, not because of a project, not because of a successful exhibition or keynote, but because of her. The headline from the local press read, "Museum director alleges sister pushed her downstairs. Footage confirms assault." It was a small outlet, barely syndicated. But in the age of screenshots and outrage, it didn't need to be CNN. By the end of the day, it had been shared thousands of times across LinkedIn, Facebook, even Twitter. My inbox overflowed. My museum email had to be temporarily frozen by IT. And just like that, the silence I'd lived under for years shattered in full view. I didn't hide. But I didn't speak. Not yet. Letting the evidence speak had always been more powerful than trying to scream into a crowd that already had their minds made up. Denise, my second in command at Northbridge, called me first. Her voice shook with emotion. "We believe you. We always did. We didn't know how bad it was." She explained that the board had scheduled an emergency meeting, not to remove me, but to publicly support me. Apparently, the museum's donors were already discussing a plan to make a statement, to stand by the integrity of leadership. I blinked at the phone, overwhelmed by something I didn't recognize right away. Relief. For so long, I had expected the fall, the collapse, the moment everything I built would slip away, the moment I stopped smiling. But it hadn't. It was holding. The next call came from a different kind of voice. Carla Whitmore, a well-known arts journalist who had interviewed me years ago for a small column. She left a voicemail. "Gabriella, I've followed your work since the Emerson residency. I'm reaching out not for the scandal, but because I think this moment says something bigger. If you ever want to talk about surviving sabotage, not just in art but in life, I'd love to give you that space." I didn't reply. Not yet. But I saved the message. I spent the next few days at Aunt Lily's. Her home was the opposite of the world I'd just left. Quiet, unpolished, real. The kind of place where you could drink tea at noon and cry without explaining why. Her garden was overgrown, the screen door squeaked, and her dog Max shed fur like confetti. It was perfect. Every night I sat outside with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the stars above the trees, and wondering how many versions of me had already been erased over the years. Versions rewritten by Amelia, edited by my parents, dismissed by mentors, questioned by colleagues. But not this time. This version of me, the one who stood up, who stayed standing, was permanent. The museum issued its official statement the following Monday. It was brief but powerful. We support our director, Gabriella Hart, as she navigates this personal challenge. Her leadership, vision, and integrity remain invaluable to our institution. We stand firmly behind her. It was signed by the full board. When I read it, something inside me cracked open, not because I needed validation, but because it was the first time I'd seen someone defend me in public, not just in whispers or in private texts, but with their name, with weight. The flood of support that followed surprised me. Former interns, colleagues, a gallery owner from my early 20s who remembered how I stayed until 1 a.m., hanging pieces others had forgotten to label, a guest speaker from a conference who admitted she'd been afraid to invite me because Amelia had told her I was unstable. Even strangers began messaging, artists, directors, professionals who'd been gaslighted, sabotaged, dismissed. One message read, "You're showing all of us what it looks like to survive while still leading. Thank you." Another, "My sister ruined my first job offer by telling the company I'd lied on my resume. I never spoke out. Watching you speak makes me wish I had." I started saving the messages in a folder called True. I didn't know what I'd do with them yet, but I knew they mattered. Amelia, on the other hand, was spiraling. Her Instagram went from curated pastels to silence, then reactivated with carefully worded apologies that said nothing, then deleted again. A vague post about healing, a private account, then suddenly public again with comment limits. It was a cycle. The final shift came later that week. I received a call from Mr. Dawson, museum founder and longtime family acquaintance. We hadn't spoken directly since before the fall. He sounded older, heavier. "Gabriella, I owe you an apology." He said he had known something was off, that Amelia's presence at the exhibit had felt wrong, that she inserted herself in ways that felt performative. But he didn't say anything, because he didn't want to get involved in family things. Now, he realized his silence helped enable the harm. I told him thank you, not because I needed his apology, but because he offered it without being forced. And that mattered. By the end of the week, I returned to the museum, still sore, still healing, but walking. Every staff member paused as I entered. Some smiled softly, others simply nodded. Denise rushed to my side and hugged me so tightly I winced, but I didn't let go. I walked past the wing where the fall had happened. The staircase had been cordoned off, temporarily under maintenance, according to the sign, but it would reopen. And when it did, I wanted to walk down those stairs again, on my terms. Because the thing about being pushed is, yes, you fall, but when you rise again, people finally see how high you can stand. Returning to the museum wasn't about reclaiming a building. It was about reclaiming my voice in a space where I'd once been told to be quiet, be polite, be small. I walked those halls differently now, not as someone who had been pushed, but as someone who had chosen to rise from the fall without pretending it didn't happen. Every corner felt sharper, more honest. Even the art on the walls seemed to echo louder, as if it, too, had been holding its breath. But peace never lasted long when my family was involved. 3 weeks before the trial, a notification buzzed on my phone as I reviewed upcoming installations. Amelia had posted, again. The caption read like a press release disguised as vulnerability. There was a soft focus image of her holding an old childhood photo of the two of us. In the post, she claimed to be on a healing journey, admitting to mistakes, but never quite naming them. She framed the upcoming trial as a tragic chapter in our otherwise beautiful bond. and called for forgiveness above division. The comments were turned off. I didn't need them to know exactly what this was. It wasn't healing, it was rehearsal. This was the part where she rewrote the script one last time, this time for the court of public opinion. Not to exonerate herself legally, but to retain some version of her image. If she couldn't be innocent, she'd settle for misunderstood. And if that failed, she'd become the victim of a vindictive sister unwilling to let go. People like Amelia didn't confess. They rebranded. Still, it hit me harder than I expected. Not because I believed her, but because I knew how many others might. Because this wasn't the first time she'd weaponized sentimentality to cover cruelty. Because I had spent years buried under that same charm offensive, unsure whether I was too sensitive, too serious, too unwilling to laugh it off. But this time, I wasn't the one second-guessing. I was the one watching from solid ground. 2 days later, I received the formal notice. Amelia and her team had submitted a public proposal to settle the case. No admission of guilt, no jail time, just an agreement of non-disclosure between parties and a public-facing statement crafted to preserve reputations and encourage healing. Reading the draft felt like drowning in sugar water. They wanted me to sign a document that said we had resolved things privately with mutual understanding, and that I wished her well in her personal journey. They wanted a photograph of us shaking hands, 2 women, mature and evolved, moving forward from pain. It was theater, and they were asking me to step back into the role I'd been assigned since birth, the one who kept quiet for the sake of appearances. But I wasn't interested in preserving their performance anymore. I didn't want vengeance. I wanted clarity, and I wanted the truth to live somewhere other than in my own mouth. Rejecting the offer was easy, emotionally, at least. Professionally, it came with a wave of new messages. People I hadn't heard from in years, now reaching out just to check in. Some truly supportive. Others veiled in concern about how long this might drag on, or whether continued litigation might damage the museum's reputation. But I had already survived the most dangerous form of damage, being disbelieved by those closest to me, and no external risk compared to that internal fracture. I spent the next week preparing for trial, long conversations with my lawyer, review sessions with the DA, walkthroughs of the sequence of events, both physical and emotional. Revisiting the fall was never easy. Watching the footage again felt like reliving the moment frame by frame, except now, I could see the pieces I'd missed the first time. The way her eyes scanned the hallway before pushing me, the deliberate angle of her approach, the absence of hesitation. But most haunting of all was what came after the fall. The performance. The frantic run for help, the shriek, the carefully timed collapse to her knees. If you muted the footage, it could have passed for a scene from a tragedy. I'd seen better acting in experimental theater, and that realization, oddly, gave me strength. Because I wasn't a character in her story anymore. I was the author of mine. A week before trial, I took a walk through the west wing of the museum, past one of my favorite pieces, a mixed media sculpture about memory and weight. I stared at it for a long time. It reminded me of something I once told myself when I was a student, that art could only truly matter when it was honest, that the most beautiful thing I could ever create was a life that reflected what I actually lived, not what someone else needed me to pretend. I thought of the young artists who had interned under me, the girls who'd pulled me aside after meetings to say they wanted to learn how to lead like me, quietly, but with purpose. The ones who stayed late just to watch how I handled pressure without crumbling. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was showing them that leadership could survive betrayal, that silence didn't protect legacies, it erased them, that telling the truth, even when your voice shakes, is an act of creation as bold as any brushstroke. The trial was coming, and this time, I wouldn't be falling downstairs. I'd be walking in, with every step grounded in truth. The courtroom looked the same, but the energy had changed. This wasn't a preliminary hearing or a scheduling session. This was real. This was trial. Every chair was occupied. Every camera was positioned. Every breath in the room carried weight. The walls themselves seemed to hold tension in their plaster. I sat in the front, beside my attorney, dressed in muted blue and calm restraint. I didn't wear black. I wasn't grieving. I wasn't mourning a loss. I was standing in the middle of reclamation, and I refused to dress like a victim. Across the aisle, Amelia sat between her lawyers again. Her face was even more carefully constructed now. No visible makeup, no jewelry, just a cardigan and posture meant to signal humility. She didn't look at me. Not once. Not when I entered. Not when the judge took the bench. Not even when the charges were read aloud in full. The trial opened with the prosecution laying out their case, methodically, carefully. Not just the incident itself, but the pattern, the build-up, the digital trail, the witness list. Every piece of evidence they'd fought to admit now sat in neat folders on a table, waiting to be unfolded under oath. It felt surreal hearing my name used so formally, so frequently. Ms. Gabriella Hart, director of Northbridge Contemporary, the victim, Ms. Hart, sustained a fractured rib, wrist, and concussion. Ms. Hart had previously documented conflict with the defendant. But I wasn't a file number. I wasn't a line item. I was still sitting right there, alive, present, and I intended to stay that way for every moment of it. They played the video again, slower this time, frame by frame. The footage I had once watched alone in a hospital bed now filled the courtroom, projected for a jury of 12 to see with unfiltered eyes. There were gasps, small involuntary reactions from the people behind me. The jurors looked rattled, a few scribbled notes. One looked directly at me after the footage ended, not with pity, with recognition. Then came the digital evidence, the screenshots from Jonah, the voice memos, the time-stamped texts that detailed not just intent, but resentment. Months of it, maybe years. The prosecutor read each message aloud with steady tone and no flourish. That was the key. Let the words speak for themselves. Let Amelia's own voice do what mine had never been able to. Prove it. I watched my parents fidget behind her. They had come, of course. Not because they wanted the truth, but because appearances mattered. They still believed this was a misunderstanding. Or at least, they needed the world to think so. They hadn't spoken to me since the hearing. I didn't expect them to. The defense began with what I'd predicted: narrative reshaping. They focused on our childhood, the pressures of family expectation, the dynamic between two gifted daughters. They painted Amelia as someone overshadowed, insecure, misunderstood. They used soft words, imbalance, strain, fragile temperament. They even tried to characterize her texts as sarcastic venting, the voice memos as taken out of emotional context. They questioned my memory, my perception. They brought up a stress-related leave I had taken 4 years ago after a major exhibit collapsed due to funding loss. They suggested it demonstrated instability. They were trying to tell the jury that yes, I was hurt, but maybe not the way I thought. Maybe I'd misunderstood the push. Maybe I slipped. Maybe I projected. Maybe I imagined it all. But I didn't flinch. Because the video didn't lie. Because my bones didn't lie. Because survivors learn to recognize gaslighting when it walks into the room wearing cologne and calling itself a defense strategy. The hardest part wasn't watching them question my sanity. It was watching Amelia sit through it, silent, unflinching, unmoved. She didn't stop them. She didn't correct the lies. She didn't even blink when they implied I had exaggerated my injuries for attention. And that silence was louder than any spoken betrayal. When it was finally my turn to take the stand, I stood without assistance. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I had to. I was sworn in, asked to state my name, my position, my account of events. I spoke plainly, narrating the facts, tracing the timeline. No theatrics, no tears, just truth. The cross-examination came fast. The defense tried to trip me with tone, tried to twist my words, asked the same question 3 ways to see if I'd falter. But I didn't. Because when you've been gaslit for years, you learn how to carry a mirror. At one point, they implied that my rise in the museum world may have come at the expense of personal sensitivity. That was the moment I understood something clearly. They weren't just defending Amelia's actions. They were punishing me for daring to succeed in spite of them. The trial recessed for lunch. I walked out slowly, not looking at anyone, not needing to. Outside, the air hit my face like salt water, sharp and cold and cleansing. The world didn't feel smaller, it felt realer. The trial would resume after lunch with more witness testimony. Denise, Jonah, even a former professor who had once caught Amelia plagiarizing a presentation but had let it go under pressure from our parents. They were all prepared to speak, not because I asked them to, but because silence no longer served them either. As I waited in a quiet room with a water bottle I didn't open, I realized I wasn't afraid of the verdict. I was afraid of what came next. Life without the mask. No more pretending to be the agreeable sister. No more ignoring the digs, the dismissals, the thefts of credit. No more walking on eggshells just to preserve an image of family unity that never actually existed. I wasn't chasing vindication anymore. I was stepping into truth. And whether the jury saw it or not, I had already won something far greater than a legal case. I had won myself back. The final day of trial arrived with the same weight as the first, but something inside me had shifted. Not lighter, not calmer, just clearer. I wasn't waiting for justice anymore. I wasn't waiting for validation. I was here to witness something finish. And for the first time in years, I had nothing left to hide. The courtroom filled early, reporters lined the back rows, observers whispered in corners. The air buzzed with that strange tension that only exists when truth feels close enough to touch. Judge Harris entered with the same efficient stride, face unreadable. The jury filed in behind her, solemn and serious. I watched them carefully, not because I wanted to guess the outcome, but because I wanted to remember this moment. All of it. The quiet, the breath, the closing of a story I hadn't chosen, but had chosen to tell. The foreperson stood. Papers were shuffled. Time expanded. And then came the words. On the charge of felony assault with intent to cause bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty. The rest of the charges followed. Lesser, procedural, but all with the same outcome. Guilty. Amelia didn't move. Neither did my parents. The silence that followed was unlike the others I'd experienced in that room. This one wasn't oppressive. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't pretending not to notice. It was something closer to stillness. An acknowledgement, perhaps. A reckoning. The judge set sentencing for a future date and dismissed the jury. Then, with a firm but compassionate tone, she addressed the room. Not just the court, but the idea of what had happened. Family does not excuse violence, legacy does not excuse cruelty, and love, when weaponized, becomes a tool of destruction, not connection. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. What I felt wasn't release. It was arrival. Like I had finally reached the edge of something, and instead of falling, I had learned to stop walking in circles and stand still. Amelia was taken out quietly, flanked by her legal team. She didn't look back. My parents exited behind her, their faces drained of performance. Not angry, not vindictive, just hollow. The kind of hollow that happens when a version of a family collapses under the weight of its own denial. I stayed seated for a while, not because I couldn't stand, but because I could. When I finally stepped outside, the sky was pale blue, the air brisk. Reporters asked if I wanted to make a statement. I shook my head. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said inside that room, through evidence, through silence, through resilience. Instead, I went home, not to my old apartment, not to Aunt Lily's, but to a quiet space I had rented the week prior, a small cabin just outside the city, with no internet, no cell service, and nothing but trees and a single chair on the porch. I stayed there for 3 days. No television, no press, no reminders. I listened to the wind move through pine branches. I watched a deer walk the edge of the clearing. I let the quiet rearrange the pieces of me that had been fractured by noise for years. And somewhere in that stillness, I realized something important. I wasn't broken. I was bruised, tired, weathered maybe, but not broken, because broken things can't build, and I had already begun building again. When I returned to the museum, Denise greeted me with that same quiet strength she always carried. The staff had organized a small welcome, coffee, cards, a handful of flowers on my desk, but no spectacle, just warmth, just presence. That was all I needed. A week later, I received a letter, handwritten. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Amelia. The letter was long, apologetic in structure, careful in language. It detailed memories from our childhood, shared laughter, sleepovers, moments she said she missed. It acknowledged the fall, admitted to the push, but framed it again as a moment of emotional collapse. She said she hoped someday we could rebuild, that she understood if we couldn't. I read it once, folded it, put it away. Not because I forgave her, and not because I didn't, but because healing, for me, no longer depended on whether she understood what she had done. Forgiveness was not my finish line. Peace was, and I had found it long before that letter arrived. In the months that followed, the museum continued to grow. I curated an exhibition titled Unseen Lines, a collection of works from female artists who had been overshadowed, silenced, or doubted. The reception was overwhelming. Visitors lined the halls. One journalist called it a quiet revolution in frame and form. It was more than art. It was reflection. And in one of the corners, tucked quietly behind a beam of natural light, was a small plaque. It read, "To those who rise, even when pushed. No name, no credit, just truth. The kind that doesn't need headlines to matter." Sometimes I still think of her. Amelia. Not with anger, not with hope either. Just with distance, like someone you once tried to hold on to in a dream, only to realize they were never really yours to begin with, that they existed in your life more as a test than a companion. She taught me how deep silence can cut, but she also taught me how strong truth can grow. I walk differently now, not just at work, in life. My steps don't ask permission. They carry presence. And in every stride, I remember what it took to rebuild what she tried to break. And I never forget. The fall wasn't my ending. It was my beginning. Before you go, don't forget to like this video, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means more than you know, and stories like this deserve to be heard.